June 28, 1944, 22 days after Allied boots first found French sand. The room smelled of gun oil and cigarette smoke, maps layered like funerary shrouds across the table. Messengers came and went with reports whose edges were already frayed by bad news. Men in field gray hunched over the maps and pointed at lines of red and blue, at places where iron and flesh met tide and sand. In that small, overheated headquarters, witnesses later reconstructed a single, incandescent moment. Erwin Rommel, Field Marshal, the man the propaganda machine had once wrapped in desert white and lionized as the desert fox, stood up from his chair and slammed his hand onto the map. His face was raw with a soldier's fury, more exhausted than enraged, the kind of anger born of seeing a strategy die in plain view. "End this war before it ends you," he shouted. This is a reconstruction drawn from accounts of his blunt warnings and the bluntness of his temperament. Though no source preserves this precise sentence verbatim, the outburst captures the urgency Rommel repeatedly expressed in the desperate weeks after June 6th, a command from a tactician who had come to believe that continuance would mean annihilation. That sentence hangs in the air because it is the concentrated image of everything that followed, a soldier's plea issued against the machinery of fanaticism. It is easy to mistake this scene for an act of moral clarity divorced from complexity. The Rommel who thumped the table in June 1944 was the product of three wars: the trenches of World War I, the pantherish maneuvers of the North African deserts, and the political theater of Nazi Germany. To understand why a man who once smiled beside Hitler and posed for newsreels would, in the twilight of his command, beg for an end, we must follow the arc of his life, the rise that made his voice weighty enough to matter, and the slow erosion that made him desperate. Erwin Rommel was born to a modest family in 1891 and came of age in an era that still worshipped the soldier's romance. He earned his stripes the hard way, the mud of the Western Front, nights spent listening for the whisper of enemy boots, mornings counting the cost in men. From those first months, his reputation was built on an unusual combination: a calmness in chaos and a knack for reading the battlefield. He fought at Arras, at the Somme. He received the Pour le Mérite not because he sought fame, but because his superiors saw in him a commander who could bend space and time on the battlefield, who could make the enemy fold at the right moment. Between the wars, Rommel remained a professional soldier, not a politician. He wrote, studied, and taught. When Hitler came to power, the new regime needed regimented faces to legitimize its rise. Rommel, with his military pedigree and charismatic presence, was an asset. He accepted positions that placed him close to the center of power.
He accompanied Hitler and his entourage on state visits, posed for photographs that would be repurposed by Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry, and, in time, received promotions that thrust him into the spotlight. This was not at first a marriage of equals. Rommel cared about soldiers and movement. The regime cared about symbolism and obedience. But the relationship worked for a while. Rommel was rewarded with command and honors. The regime received a pliant hero to place in its gallery. Goebbels called him a man of action. Newsreels showed Rommel standing tall, dusted in desert white, as cameras recorded every deliberate gesture. The public image hardened into myth, a master of mobile warfare, a leader who rode at the front with his troops and whose decisions turned the tide in localized battles. North Africa was where Rommel's legend was most nourished. Arriving in 1941 to support Italy's faltering campaigns, he transformed what was supposed to be a limited intervention into a theater of bold improvisational maneuvers. He moved fast, struck where the Allies did not expect, and used the desert's open spaces to his advantage. Tanks prowled like hunting packs. Supply lines became the central flaw of both armies. Rommel learned to stretch, to lash small victories into morale gains. The press christened him the Desert Fox for his ability to appear and vanish, to strike where the enemy was weakest. But legend is never the whole story. Rommel's victories were tactical and often spectacular, yet they were sometimes achieved at great cost and sustained by an armored fleet that strained under supply shortages. He admired bravery and demanded it. He was a soldier shaped by discipline and a belief in duty, and that duty began, increasingly, to weigh against the political orders that came from Berlin. Even before the invasion of Normandy, cracks appeared in Rommel's trust. Rumors of mass shootings, of Jews being deported and murdered, reached the front lines as whispered facts. He was not naive about the Nazi regime's inclinations. He had seen its instruments of power and the men who wielded them. Yet he was not a political dissident in the intellectual sense. His allegiance was to the army, to strategy, to the protection of German soil and its people, at least as he defined them. Over time, the dignity of the soldier clashed with the monstrous policies emanating from the Nazi hierarchy. He had to reconcile obedience with conscience. The event that would make that reconciliation urgent was the prospect of an Allied invasion. By 1943 and into 1944, the question of defending the Reich's western seaboard consumed Rommel. Promoted to field marshal and given responsibility for the defense of Western Europe, he moved to shore up what came to be called the Atlantic Wall, a coastal system of bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, mines, underwater defenses, and concrete teeth fixed into Normandy's cliffs and beaches.
Unlike many of his contemporaries who pictured a steamroller defense inland, Rommel argued that the only hope lay in stopping the invader at the waterline. His logic was stark. If Allied forces could establish lodgements on the beaches, the sheer superiority of Allied air power and firepower made counterattacks exponentially harder. To Rommel, the sea itself was a battlefield to be contested. He threw men and materials into fortifications. Where budgets were tight and labor scarce, he improvised. Field engineers sandbagged cliffs, farmers' tractors were pressed into service to move concrete, and civilian laborers, including forced labor, a grim fact Rommel could not ignore, were used to fill the factories behind the wall. He ordered the emplacement of beach-cratering obstacles, wooden stakes with hatchets, and Rommel's favored anti-tank hedgehogs. He sent officers along the coast to survey beaches and imagine every conceivable approach. But for all his tactical insight, Rommel confronted two problems he could not engineer away. The first was deception. The Allies, through Operation Fortitude, built a narrative that suggested the main invasion would come at the Pas de Calais. Inflatable tanks and dummy camps, fake radio traffic, and a phantom army under General Patton drew German eyes eastward. The second problem was politics. Control over the armored reserves remained tied to Hitler's insistence on centralized command. Rommel wanted tanks close to the coast, ready to punch the invader back into the sea. High command, fearful of misallocating forces and haunted by earlier blunders, argued restraint. Hitler, who distrusted dispersal and prized the positional defense that could be held like a fortress, was seldom convinced by the bluntness of Rommel's logic. Personal friction compounded strategic disagreements. Rommel's habit of upending established protocols, of moving forward to inspect beaches in person, of favoring quick, localized decisions over top-down strictures, aggravated those who preferred the predictability of doctrine. At the same time, Goebbels and the propaganda machine continued to orbit Rommel's image, painting him as a loyal warrior. Publicly, Rommel remained useful to the regime. Privately, he chafed. Friends and aides who watched him closely saw the change. Hans Speidel, his chief of staff, described his increasing impatience with political machinations and his obsession with the single, clear problem at hand, an invasion that could not be allowed to achieve a foothold. Then came June 6, 1944. The landing force the Allies had amassed was vast beyond the imagination of most German planners. Amphibious and airborne troops, the air armadas that poured over Normandy, and the countless ships that rolled like an oceanic wall, all of it created a shock Rommel had feared. Importantly, on the morning of D-Day, Rommel was not at his command post on the French coast. He was in Germany, at home in Harrowing, close to family, tending to matters of personal and professional life, visits, briefings, and the strain of endless inspections. The reasons for his absence were not metaphysical, they were human. Officers of all ranks travel. Men with wives and children seek breath. That circumstance, small and banal, would become the seed of later accusations from those who wished to minimize his responsibility or to paint him as cowardly. In truth, his absence on June 6th did not reflect neglect so much as the fractured reality of a conductor whose orchestra of command had been scattered by political interference. When the invasion began and reports filtered in, Rommel did not flinch. He left his family and made a rapid return to France. What he found hardened his conviction. The Allied lodgements, once established, would not be easily dislodged. From the battered dunes and churned countryside, he quickly assessed the strategic reality.
The Allies had achieved local superiority on the beaches and would leverage air and naval power to resupply and reinforce. To Rommel, this was the moment he had warned about for months. He sent messages up the chain and attempted to move armored reserves forward. He clashed with other commanders who either doubted the invasion's scale or feared Hitler's reaction to unauthorized redeployments. The command structure was paralyzed by procedures as much as by loyalty. The center would not or could not relinquish control. Rommel watched as opportunities slipped away. The famous tension between the centralized dictatorship at the top and the local realities at the front played out in the worst possible way. As the weeks ticked by, Rommel's warnings grew sharper and more personal. He stopped pouching his assessments in the abstract language of logistics and began to speak in terms of survival. The men at the front, who saw him conduct inspections and move among units, saw a commander not merely worried about victory, but about the fate of Germany itself. His voice, always blunt, often colored by the crisp grammar of a soldier, took on a note of desperation. Those who knew him best noticed the change. Manfred, his son, later recalled in subdued terms how his father had aged and how during family moments he would sometimes fall silent for long stretches after a briefing. He carried scenes of the beaches in his silence, Manfred would paraphrase, remembering the look of a commander who had counted losses and seen trajectories, not just of troops but of nations. These recollections appear in multiple post-war testimonies and give us a human window into a figure often ossified by myth. Complicating Rommel's internal struggle was the growing realization that the regime itself was not merely failing tactically, but was committing crimes that even a professional soldier could not fully reconcile with the honor of the uniform.
Reports of atrocities, deportations, and systematic murder accumulated into a background hum of moral disturbance. Rommel was no doctrinal savior. He was not a conspirator in the early 1940s plotting to dismantle Nazism. Yet the soldier's code he held, the obligation to protect the homeland and to minimize suffering, began to diverge from the political costs demanded by Hitler's unyielding strategy. This is the moment where duty split into forks that no training could reconcile: loyalty to the army, which had been the axis of his life, and the dawning sense that continuing the war meant the destruction of what he had sworn to serve. Strategic realism, which had once been a technical virtue, now carried moral weight. By late June, the odds were mounting against the German defense in the West. Operation Fortitude's success at Deception had bought the Allies precious minutes and misdirected resources. Rommel knew the Pas-de-Calais gambit had misled the high command. He knew the Germans were not massing reserves where the invasion was actually happening. He knew that unless armored forces were freed to act near the beaches, the already grim situation could slip into catastrophe. He tried, in dispatches and in meetings, to translate his tactical prescriptions into political action. What he encountered was the machinery of a state that prized image over adaptation, and the will of a leader who distrusted independent initiative. When Rommel's communications went unanswered or were rebuffed, his language turned less like a report and more like an ultimatum. He spoke of the beaches, of the necessity of reversing course, of the possibility of negotiating to prevent further devastation. Each plea carried the echo of his desert logic. When supply lines are cut and mobility is lost, positions become tombs. Stubbornly refusing to grant command flexibility, the central authorities tethered mobile units to an impervious doctrine. Rommel watched doctrine bind the formerly living art of war into a rigid, brittle thing. The summer of 1944 thus became an anatomy of failure, a mixture of Allied operational brilliance, German deception by design, and the tragic consequences of political obstinacy. Rommel's career had put him at the fulcrum where tactics and politics collided. His voice, once amplified by state propaganda and public adoration, now seemed to echo into the void. Still, he did not abandon his sense of duty. He continued to organize defenses, to inspect fortifications, to coordinate local counterattacks. He still believed, as soldiers often must, that action could shape outcomes. Yet with each dispatch refused and each reserve held back, his posture shifted from confident commander to urgent intercessor. He began to speak plainly as not simply tactical advice, but as a mortal obligation to those whose lives he could influence.
Late in June, as radio reports widened the circle of disaster, Hans Speidel and other aides attempted to mediate between Rommel's blunt demands and the impossible constraints of Hitler's command style. They tried to frame Rommel's concerns in the language of doctrine, of need, of operational expedience, anything to make Berlin hear. Over and over, Rommel's messages returned with the same affliction: delay. It is in this climate that the reconstructed outburst, the one with which this story opened, must be placed. The phrase is emblematic, but it is emblematic for a reason. A soldier who had once been lifted by propaganda now saw that he and the nation were being destroyed by the very apparatus that had once propelled him. To have begged for an end was not to surrender, It was to prevent an even worse hollowing out of state and society. The anger that flashed across his face in that reconstructed scene was a sorrow that had boiled over. What followed historically were consequences that Rommel could not have foreseen. Within weeks, he would be removed from effective command by chance and design. On July 17th, a car ambush, an event historians have meticulously traced to a road accident possibly set against a backdrop of tensions, would leave him gravely injured, a moment that removed him from frontline decisions at a critical moment. The July 20 assassination attempt against Hitler would unfold in the vacuum of confusion, and the brutal purge that followed would sweep many who had spoken against the regime into ruin. Long before those events, however, Rommel's reputation had become a battlefield of its own. Within the apparatus of Nazi propaganda, his image could be used as proof of legitimacy. Outside it, opposition voices could point to his later warnings as evidence of dissent. Post-war, historians and politicians would quarrel over whether Rommel was a reluctant participant, a passive accommodationist, or a late-stage opponent. The truth resists easy labels. He had, at times, sought proximity to power and toured as its instrument. He had also, in the end, stretched beyond obedience into something that looked like conscience, albeit a conscience still tangled in a soldier's vocabulary. Rommel's personal life reflected the strain. Lucy, his wife, and Manfred, his son, bore the weight of a man who arrived home with sand in his boots and thunder in his eyes. In recollections recorded after the war, family members described long silences, abrupt departures, and a man whose professional identity had become entangled with catastrophe. These human details cannot resolve the grander moral puzzles, but they remind us that historic choices are made by people who sleep, eat, and yearn. By the last days of June, the strategic map had been redrawn by blood and tide. The Allied lodgements in Normandy, reinforced every day, created a new front that threatened the integrity of Western Europe.
Rommel's technical solutions, closer tank placements, immediate counterattacks, were increasingly urgent. His pleas were increasingly personal. He was no longer a distant marshal issuing orders. He was a man who had counted losses and watched lines shrink. The longer the war continued without accommodation, the more he believed Germany itself could be consumed. In the quiet moments, he turned over one possibility that haunted him, the idea of forcing the regime to accept a halt, of negotiating conditions to save what could be salvaged. To suggest this was tantamount to treason in certain circles. To others, it was the only realistic path to reduced bloodshed. Rommel weighed the cost in soldiers and civilians, in cities, and in the ethos of a people. He was not a pacifist, nor a politician advocating surrender. He was a commander making a cold calculation about survival. And so he prepared to act in the only way he believed he could, by raising his voice, by pressing his case, by confronting the political center that refused to hear. The machinery that isolated the front from the capital had always been part bureaucracy, part personality, and part ideological fanaticism. To break it required a combination of force and moral clarity Rommel was not sure he possessed, but he had worn the mantle of decisive action before. He now chose to put it on again, not to win glory, but to alter a course he believed ruinous. As June dissolved into July and the beaches remained stubbornly in Allied hands, Rommel found allies and enemies in unexpected places. Some officers agreed with his tactical assessments, but dreaded the political fallout. Others saw consultation with Hitler as the only legitimate channel, however ineffective. Speidel took notes, collected impressions, and tried to translate Rommel's battlefield talk into messages that could be understood at court. Men who had once cheered his desert dashes now feared the consequences of opposing the machine that had created them. By the end of the month, the consequences of this friction would begin to materialize. Rommel would be taken from the front for reasons that combined misfortune and inimitable political calculation. Meanwhile, other forces closed in on the scene. The July 20 plotters, driven by their own mixtures of patriotism and desperation, were preparing a gamble that would either topple Hitler or doom those associated with any hint of dissent. Rommel's position was precarious in more ways than one. The theater he had once mastered now required a kind of politics he had never desired to practice. To survive as a military leader meant speaking truth to a leader who equated truth with betrayal. To protect his country meant confronting a man who saw retreat as sin. He had, in a dozen dispatches, outlined the mechanics of a different defense. He had, in private meetings, appealed for flexibility. He had, in at least one reconstructed outburst, demanded an end to prevent annihilation.
Those acts now converged into a single trajectory. Rommel, a soldier formed by battles of maneuver and honor, was preparing to make a choice whose consequences would ripple far beyond the map table. As the calendar turned toward July and the Normandy campaign hardened into a grinding war of attrition, Rommel packed his small kit in the heavy intimacy of a commander's room and made arrangements that would take him away from the immediacy of the beaches. He moved through the circuit of officers, exchanged hurried notes, and gathered the few confidants whose loyalty he trusted. The road ahead branched into paths he did not relish, to plead for life, to negotiate, to resign, or to confront the impossible. In the corridors of power, the engines of reprisal were already warming. Those who sought to protect the regime could not tolerate challenges to the will of the Führer. Those who sought the nation's survival saw in Rommel a voice that might yet be used to pull Germany back from total collapse. For Rommel, these competing demands compounded the moral gravity of every action. And so, at the threshold of a month that would change everything, he took one last private look at the maps he had memorized and the faces he had trusted. The beaches were still a bruise on Europe's flank. The armored reserves remained entangled in a command web. The man at the center of it all, Adolf Hitler, remained unmovable in his convictions. Rommel understood, as any competent commander must, that strategy without political will is only paper. He also understood that there would come a point when the cost of action or inaction would not be measured only in military terms, but in the ruin of a nation. He left the room and stepped toward a train that would take him away from the immediate front, but toward a confrontation he believed unavoidable. Word spread along the lines. Rommel was traveling. Some breathed easier. Others tightened their shoulders. The reconstructed outburst, the slamming hand, the plea to end the war, had been a symptom and a moment both. It was a moment of anger and of sorrow, of tactical insight and moral alarm. What remained was the question of consequence. Would a field marshal's plea alter the course of a totalitarian state committed to grinding on, even to the brink of ruin? The answer would not arrive swiftly. It would come in fragments of fortune. Accidents on roads, secret meetings, plots formed by men whose guilt and courage would be judged later. But in those closing days of June, as Rommel boarded his train, and the English Channel rolled like a forbidding ledger between nations, the stakes were unmistakable. The war had already begun to consume Europe. Rommel had, in fits and starts, seen the shape of that consumption.
Now he would test whether a soldier's bluntness could persuade a regime to change its course, or whether, like so many other attempts to temper fanaticism from within, it would be answered with silence and violent reprisal. Rommel's train rolled east beneath a sky that had the color of old ink and the sameness of long habit. He stared at a map as the countryside blurred, tracing with a finger the coastline he had tried to fortify, measuring in his mind the space between intention and result. He was a man wearied by logistics and moral arithmetic, convinced that every hour lost made the ledger of destruction longer. Allies built lodgements, Berlin offered platitudes. The gap between those two truths was closing too quickly. For all the urgency in his messages, Rommel did not imagine his voice alone could bend the machine of power. He understood how propaganda had once polished him into a public reliquary. He had seen the image of the desert fox travel farther than the facts that birthed it. Now that same machine was deaf to his warnings. He counted friends who had become cautious courtiers and colleagues who trembled with fear more than they burned with conviction. He also knew that once a critical mass of officers and officials moved toward agreement, that negotiation, not annihilation, was necessary. The cost of acting would be enormous. If this moment of decision felt cinematic, it also felt procedural. Rommel made arrangements. He met privately with Hans Speidel and a small circle of officers who might translate his technical language into political terms. He prepared dispatches, insisted on immediate local flexibility for armored units, and pressed for the release of reserves he believed could blunt the Allied lodgements at the beaches. He wrote letters and made telephone calls. He sought to convert the military truth into a political imperative. None of it moved rapidly enough. On July 17, 1944, fate intervened in a way neither strategy nor courage could foresee. Returning from a meeting near St. Mary-Cleys, Rommel's car was struck in an incident that left him gravely wounded. For years afterward, historians would sift through reports and testimonies, parsing whether the crash had been a deliberate attempt to kill him or a tragic accident born of war's chaos. The simplest archival truth held: his injuries were severe enough to remove him from effective command during a crucial window. He would be taken away from the beaches not by surrender or reprieve, but by blood and metal. In hospital wards, under the insistent glare of antiseptic lights and the whisper of nurses, Rommel's body was repaired while his influence ebbed. The physical vulnerability translated into political exposure. A man who had been near the front, who had ridden the dunes and walked with soldiers, was suddenly isolated in rooms where conversations could be controlled and where the regime could shape narratives.
his convalescence became, in effect, a removal.
Rumors circulated fast that the Führer had personally noted the accident, that the inner circle saw an opportunity to minimize an increasingly inconvenient voice, that those who feared Rommel's blunt realism were relieved he would be out of the way. In the months that followed, every fact of that day would be refracted through motives, personal, political, and propagandistic. The crash had cost him immediate command, at a moment when his tactical instincts might still have effected quicker responses to the Allied ground. While Rommel lay recuperating, the regime's machinery tightened its nets. On July 20th, conspirators within the German military launched an attempt on Hitler's life in the Wolfschanze. The bomb at the Wolf's Lair failed to kill the Führer, and the sting that followed was brutal. Those arrested were not merely plotters. They were representatives of a fractured elite that had, in numerous corners, come to believe that the nation's destruction could be halted only by replacing its head. Rommel's position in the aftermath of July 20th was ambiguous by design and by inclination. He had, in private, expressed sympathy for the motives of men frightened by the course of the regime, and he had spoken to individuals who were involved in conspiratorial circles. He had not, as far as the evidence reliably shows, participated in planning the assassination. But sympathy could be dangerous. Association could be fatal. The regime moved with the merciless logic of a state that equated dissent with treason. Investigators and SS officers traced connections. Informants and testimonies layered complication upon complication. Some conspirators had hoped Rommel would support a change of course, that his prestige might lend legitimacy to a new order. Others had simply reported his criticisms to make him look complicit. In this climate, truth was less a simple ledger than an alloy of fear, desire, and survival. From his hospital bed, Rommel learned of the crackdown. He understood the stakes more than ever. The regime would not tolerate voices that threatened the myth of unbroken unity behind the Führer. His earlier outbursts, his blunt dispatches urging negotiation, his insistence on tactical pragmatism, all could be reinterpreted as political disloyalty. Friends who had tried to mediate found themselves pushed into impossible positions. Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, took to drafting careful notes, preserving what he could, attempting to shield his commander from the worst of rumor and retribution. The Gestapo and the SS had their own methods of persuasion. For many, those were straightforward: violence, arrest, show trials, execution. Rommel, by contrast, was not brought before a public court. Officially, he was never tried. The regime chose a different route.
High authorities, including those close to Hitler, perceived that a trial of the man celebrated in newsreels would risk exposing fractures in the Wehrmacht the regime desperately wanted hidden. The solution they offered was a brutal calculus of expediency. On the morning of October 14th, Rommel was visited by emissaries bearing choices he could not accept as choices. Under guard, and with the promise of a certain kind of death, he was told he could end his life privately and be given a state funeral, with his family spared and his honors preserved, a sanitized narrative the regime could broadcast. Alternatively, refusal would mean public trial, humiliation, and the likely arrest and punishment of his family. The gravity of the ultimatum left little room for romantic drama. It was an administrative cruelty offered as mercy. Facing this, Rommel understood the parameters of sacrifice available to him. He was not simply weighing life against death. He was balancing the integrity of his family's future, the safety of those who trusted him, and the preservation of an image the regime would seize and reframe. There is in the human heart a calculation soldiers learn to make. Casualty counts are never merely numbers. They are faces, names, futures. Rommel chose to remove the immediate threat his presence posed to those he loved. That afternoon, he took poison. The official channels moved quickly. The regime announced that Rommel had died of wounds sustained in the July accident. The narrative left no place for treason. Joseph Goebbels, ever the master of spectacle, ordered a state funeral that mixed solemnity with propaganda. Newsreels and newspapers presented Rommel as a loyal son of the fatherland, a military genius felled by wounds and service. The paradox could not be cleaner. The state that had once exploited him for its own legitimacy now canonized his death to disguise the political fallout of the July 20 plot. The manipulation did not erase complexity. Within the Wehrmacht and among friends, different interpretations circulated. Some mourned the physical loss and remembered the tactical mind that had once saved positions against the odds. Others could not reconcile his earlier proximity to the regime with his late pleas for negotiation. Historians after the fact would sift, argue, and quarrel. Was Rommel a man who had gradually awakened to moral reality, or had he been an opportunist who discovered conscience only when convenience ended? The answer resisted full capture. Manfred Rommel, his son, later offered recollections that humanized the man in ways national narratives could not.
He spoke of the long silences, of the way his father would come home with sand in his pockets and eyes that had been tired by the sight of shorelines, of conversations cut short by the weight of decisions. He was a soldier, Manfred would say, and he tried to be a human being at the same time.
Those recollections, tender and fragmentary, became a necessary corrective to both hagiography and vilification. The state funeral and the regime's PR efforts did more than mask the circumstances of his death. They also helped fix a particular memory of Rommel in the post-war imagination. Allied occupation authorities and later West German politicians seeking figures of reconciliation would find in the Desert Fox a convenient symbol, a military professional who had not been a Nazi ideologue and who had, perhaps in late life, shown awareness of the regime's excesses. That narrative fed into a broader desire in Western Germany to rebuild a military ethos distanced from Nazism. It was useful, perhaps necessary, to set aside harder truths for the sake of political rehabilitation. Yet scholarship would not remain content to allow the image to ossify. Over decades, historians examined archival material, letters, testimonies from the Abwehr and from officers, and the patchwork of public documents. A more nuanced portrait emerged. Rommel as brilliant tactician, sometimes reckless in his pursuit of maneuver, often a sincere leader of troops, yet never a clear moral dissenter in the early years of the regime. He had benefited from proximity to power. He had accepted honors. He had not, at least initially, been a crusader against the regime's crimes. In the war's last year, however, the evidence pointed to a man whose priorities had shifted from victory to survival to a grudging attempt to spare his homeland from utter ruin. Thematically, the arc of Rommel's life asks a question about the limits of military ethics inside totalitarian systems. How does an officer reconcile obedience to command with the imperative to prevent catastrophe when that command has become itself a source of catastrophe? For Rommel, the answer arrived late and tragically. His warnings, blunt, tactical, morally shaded, were not merely arguments about troop placements. They were entreaties to a regime that would not recognize entreaty as anything other than betrayal. The irony of his fate was acute. The man who had once been elevated by propaganda to validate a regime's martial image would have his death hurriedly reframed so that the same propaganda could smooth over an inconvenient truth. Hitler, who had once used Rommel's public persona to bolster confidence, now could not tolerate a man who spoke of negotiations as a means to prevent ruin. Using Rommel's death as a spectacle was for the regime both revenge and insurance, an attempt to neutralize the risk that the public might read honesty in a famous man's dissent. Beyond propaganda and politics, there is a more particular tragedy in the soldiers Rommel commanded and in the civilians whose fates were bound to military outcomes. The Atlantic Wall, the bunkers, the mined beaches, these were not abstractions, but places where lives were counted in minutes.
Rommel had known this in a technical sense, but what made his turn toward negotiation ethically striking was the recognition that further resistance would be less about defending territory than about ensuring suffering. In that recognition is a moral act as much as a military assessment. In the decades after the war, beaches and bunkers were visited by tourists and historians alike. Concrete teeth that Rommel had ordered to catch armored advance crumbled under the same waves they were meant to have repelled. British and American veterans walked those sands and measured the cost in memory. Germans built new narratives. Rommel's photograph in desert white, that same image that had once traveled in newsreels, became fodder for debate. Was it the portrait of a complex man or a constructed symbol? Historians came to speak of Rommel's late conscience with caution. It is too neat, they argued, to cast his finally issued warnings as proof of moral heroism, but it is also too quick to brand him purely as collaborator. He was both product and critic of his time. He was a tactical genius who had let institutional prerogatives and an early accommodation to power define parts of his career. He was also a man whose professional commitments and personal attachments led him to plead, ultimately, for an alternative to annihilation. The broader lesson that historians and moralists took from Rommel's arc was not a straightforward endorsement of one mode of behavior for all. Instead, his life became a prism through which to view the variety of human responses to authoritarianism: capitulation, complicity, quiet resistance, and the desperate last acts of those who had been inside the machine and chose in its final hours to speak against it. Rommel's case also raised uncomfortable questions about the responsibilities of military leaders who serve politicized regimes. When is obedience complicity,
and when is defiance the only remaining honor? There is, moreover, the continuing ethical problem of how societies remember such figures. The temptation to recover Rommel as an anti-Nazi icon was practical for post-war Reconstruction. It allowed political elites to reclaim a professional military tradition. Yet in doing so, post-war narratives often softened inconvenient facts. The tolerance for, and even benefit from, an authoritarian state in its early period, the use of forced labor in constructing defenses, the delayed nature of his moral turn. To come to terms with Rommel honestly required both acknowledgement of his tactical gifts and the courage to hold those gifts hostage to the moral reality of the regime he served. In the end, the beachhead he feared did not collapse back into the sea. The Allied lodgements stiffened into fronts, and then into territorial gains that would sweep inland. Germany's defeat, once inevitable, accelerated in its ruin.
Rommel's plea, the dramatic exclamation reconstructed at the beginning of this story, did not persuade the highest authorities fast enough. Whether it would have had any different outcome had he not been wounded, or had his message been heard earlier at a political level, remains a matter for historical conjecture. What is less debatable is that his warnings capture a tragic form of foresight, technical accuracy entangled with moral pleading, both of which were rendered impotent by a state that could not countenance retreat. The ruins of the Atlantic Wall stand now as a mute index of those choices. Bunkers scarred by shell fire, anti-tank obstacles half buried in pebbled sand, the inscriptions of a regime's attempting to fortify itself against more than invasion, against a future that would demand accountability. A single photograph sometimes does what paragraphs cannot. A young Rommel in desert white, smiling at a horse, or the same man, older, with his field cap clutched, staring at a map. Those portraits do not resolve his contradiction. They complicate it, force us to hold both admiration for tactical prowess and condemnation for moral myopia in uneasy tension. The final image of Rommel is not tidy. He lies between public veneration and private remorse, between tactical insight and moral delay. He is a figure who taught lessons about maneuver, but also about the human cost of believing that a soldier can remain purely a soldier when political stakes are survival itself. The man who, in a reconstructed outburst, had shouted that the war must end before it ended Germany, ended his own narrative in a way the regime could incorporate and sanitize. That appropriation became part of the country's post-war memory struggles. If there is a last elegiac scene, it is not a courtroom drama or a battlefield renunciation. It is quieter. An empty headquarters on the Channel coast, maps curled at the edges. The bunker doors swung open to sea air. The concrete that once girded a fearful defense now offers little more than a place for gulls to roost. A photograph of Rommel, the one that accompanied so many press reels, leans against a crate, its white border softened by rain. Soldiers who had served under him remember boots, orders, the directness of a man who preferred to lead from the front. They also remember the slow, bitter way power socked the honor they had expected to protect. Whether Rommel's final pleas, whether framed as a reconstruction or echoing in notes and testimonies, could have changed the catastrophe that unfolded is ultimately an unanswerable historical question. The better question may be moral. What does a professional oath mean when the object of that oath becomes itself the source of destruction? Rommel's story offers no clean answer, only the slow accumulation of choices, accidents, and decisions that led a brilliant commander to confront the limits of his role. 22 days after D-Day, witnesses later reconstructed a single incandescent outburst, a field marshal slamming a hand on a map and shouting, "End this war before it ends you." Whether that phrase was spoken verbatim is less important than what it encapsulates, a soldier's warning turned moral plea, a tactical mind desperate not for victory but for survival, of people, of cities, of a nation. The Reconstruction stands not as definitive proof of conscience, but as an emblem of a tragic possibility, that recognition came too late, and that a life spent in command could be both an instrument of harm and a witness to the need for restraint. In the silence that followed his death and the louder silence of a nation picking through ruins, the bunkers eroded, the propaganda films were shelved, and the debate over legacy continued. Men like Hans Speidel went on, their memories burdened with the choices they had made. Sons like Manfred carried personal recollections that would humanize and complicate public narratives. Historians would keep arguing, unearthing documents and motives. The coast where Rommel had once paced and planned remains as testimony,
not of a single man's heroism or villainy, but of a larger failure of imagination, the failure to see that a war can consume the moral order of those who wage it. The sequence of decisions that led a state into ruin was not a single man's doing, yet the actions of generals and leaders mattered. Rommel's late, anguished plea, whether it rang aloud exactly as we reconstructed or only as sentiment in private letters and notes, reminds us how costly it can be when those in power choose rigidity over reason. If there is a last word for history, it is not vindication or condemnation alone, but the restrained admonition that truth can be spoken from within a machine and still go unheard, that warnings can be as precise as maps and as desperate as prayer, and that the moral weight of command must be measured not only in maneuvers, but in the willingness to prevent ruin. If this account has stirred your interest in the choices leaders face in war and in the complex legacy of figures like Rommel, subscribe for more deep dives into turning points of the 20th century and the lives that shaped them. The Atlantic wind still moves the maps, the sea still rewrites the sand. The photograph, left leaning on the edge of an empty table, watches the tide.